Hello guys, today I'm going to speak about the vineyard planted by God being engrafted in Jesus, as we being the branches and Him being the vine. So I'll start off by reading Isaiah 5 verse 2 and then 5 verse 7, and it says, "The Lord dug it out and cleared it of stones and planted it with choice vines, but He built a watchtower in the midst of it, hewed out a wine vat in it, looked for it to yield grapes, but it yielded wild grapes." And then Isaiah 5 verse 7 gives the interpretation and says, "For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is of Israel, and men of Judah are his pleasant planting. He looked for justice, but behold bloodshed, for righteousness, but behold an outcry." So here it speaks about God taking Israel and clearing the nations, clearing it of all nations that does idol worship and all sinful practices, and planting Israel as his choice vine. But wild grapes came out instead, and meaning he wanted a godly nation, but sin and idol worship and injustice came out instead. Here we see also in Psalm 80, I'm going to read from the Passion Translation. "Remember how you transplanted us here like a tender vine from Egypt. You cleared the land for your vineyard, evicted the nations from your land, planting us here. The roots of your vineyard went deep into the soil and filled the land with fruit. Because of your favor on your vineyard, blessings extended to every mountain of influence. Through this flourishing vineyard, mighty ones were raised up. A nation were blessed by a fruit, the vineyard of Israel." Okay. So I read up about vines and vineyards and just how the grafting process works, and how can, when you plant a choice vine, how can wild grapes come up. I needed to understand this scientifically. So grape seeds contain a mix of random traits from their parents, meaning if you plant a good seed from the fruit, it will not yield the grape, the good grape. It will yield a wild grape because of the genetic dispensation its parents had. If a field was cleared but the old grapes remained dormant in the soil, the volunteer vines, meaning the dormant vines, will sprout up like a wild vine. So if there's dormant seeds, they might sprout up like wild vines. And then graft failure. So what people would do is they would take the top part of the vine, and like a good vine such as Sauvignon or choice vines like that, and grafted into wild vines, because wild vines' roots are more resistant to pests, and they're just more resilient. Okay, so the root would be wild, but the top part would be the choice vine. Okay, so how can this do? So, graft failure. Yes, so if the roots are not tended or pruned, they will override the top part. So it is ultimately lack of maintenance. So the domesticated grapes requires intensive pruning, canopy management to produce sweet fruit. Without pruning, the vine reverts back to its natural behavior, smaller fruit, which is more acidic, and that's found in unmaintained forest. Okay, so how does this relate to Israel? So the Lord took Israel, who is the wild root. So Israel was a wild root because they came from idol worshippers and sinners. So Abram, his family was an idol worshipper, and they didn't worship the Lord, to the promised land via Abram. Now Abram became faithful and blessed, and he followed God, and he was his friend. So he came from a wild root, okay, and then God made him a choice vine, because he started to follow God. He didn't follow idols anymore, and he became his friend. He faithfully followed God. He was like a sweet grape pruned by God and maintained by his devotion to God. Up until Jacob or even Joseph, they were sweet vines. They were pruned. We see how Isaac and Jacob and even Joseph followed God. Okay, so here the wild vines were still pruned, meaning there were no idol worship, except we read it in Jacob's favorite wife. There might have been some household idols, but there were no idol worship. The roots were pruned. The old behaviors, such as idols worshipping of their parents, Terah, did not come back, okay, because they remained in friendship and in covenant with God. So the sweet fruit were there, the sweet vines were there. Okay, and then the Israelites, when they were in slavery for 400 years, they reverted back to idol worshipping, and we see this when they were so quick to build the golden calf. Okay, they were so quick to build the golden calf. Why? Because it is what was familiar to them. They were among Egyptians, among their idols, and coming from their ancestors, even though there was a covenant, they did not necessarily keep that covenant. They reverted back to the wild roots. Okay, and they needed to be pruned again by the law of God, given through Moses by God. So yes, they needed to be heavily pruned again, and God cleared the ground via Joshua and Caleb and planted them in the promised land. Okay, and here when they are in the promised land, we constantly see them going in between wild roots and good fruit. So they would revert back to idol worship. Their wild vines would come out, their wild roots would come out. So because they're not in covenant anymore, they broke the covenant. God could not prune them. They would go into slavery. They would call out to God. A deliverer would be raised up. They would follow God again. They would be in covenant for 40 years or so, and then they would go back. And this is the history of Israel. And what I've noticed is that it really all depended on the leader. If they had a godly leader, the people would revert back to the covenant of God, to the covenant worship of God, and their wild root would be pruned and contained again to yield good fruit. Okay, good leaders were the judges. They were Samuel. They were David. David was good, and also Hezekiah. He was a very good king. So those were leaders that kept the vineyard in check. He made sure no evil came out. He made sure pagan worship was demolished. Hezekiah instituted temple worship again after his father Ahaz was the most evil leader. And so, yes, he instituted that again. But his son Manasseh was super evil again. I think he was the most evil ruler there ever was in the history of Israel. So he reverted back to his wild roots, to pagan worship again. Okay, so yeah, even David called out here. He called out for because the enemies were against them, and he called out for restoration. He says how the enemy came and stole the grapes, and they ravished the vineyard. And here in verse 14, Psalm 80 verse 14, come back, O God, restore us. You are the commander of angel armies. Look down from heaven and see our crisis. Come down and care for your lovely vineyard once again. Nurture our root and our fruit with your loving care. Raise up the branch man, the son whom you've made strong. And my interpretation is speaking here about Jesus, okay? Enemies chop down our vine and set it on fire, and now show them your anger and let them perish by your frown. Strengthen this branch man, the son of your love, the son of man who dwells at your right hand. And that is such a picture of Jesus. And when we look at Jesus and how he speaks about branches and vines, it's very, very interesting. I was trying to work this out in my head, and I was thinking, how could this be? Because looking at it scientifically, it cannot be. But Jesus says, I am the vine, you are the branches, remain in me and I will remain in you. So I thought, okay, Jesus must then be the root. Okay, so where there was a wild vine's root, Jesus became our new root. And he is a perfect branch. He is the perfect vine. He is a good vine. He is the vine where you would have choice wine from. And he said, I am a good branch. Okay? I take you from darkness and pagan worship, from the kingdom of darkness, and transfer you into the kingdom of light, and you are engrafted in me, you wild vine, you are engrafted in me, and now you will bear good fruit because you are engrafted in a choice root. You are engrafted in a choice vine. And I looked it up, and it says if you do this, you will become the vine would become very resilient. Okay? Very, very, very resilient. Even though the wild vine's properties are still strong and it needs pruning. Jesus speaks about pruning and throwing every useless branch in the fire. So we have to submit under God, who is the choice vine, the choice branch. We have to submit under him, be engrafted in him, be ready to be pruned by him to bear good fruit, to bear choice fruit, okay, to bear choice fruit, so that we can have good wine, okay. And we do not have to revert back to our old nature, because that's no longer our root. When our root is Jesus, we do not have to revert back to old nature, for the law of sin has been put to death in us. And that's what Paul says. And I think, oh my goodness, it has, I felt almost like, has the old law been a setup? And Paul says, no, the law cannot take, or is not the perfect the perfect mechanism to take away sin. Instead, it shows us the very nature of sin. Jesus fulfilled the law. He came and took away sin and finally put to death that sin nature. So when we die with Christ and rise with him, we put to death that very sin nature, that very wild root. We do not have to revert back to old pagan worship, to old ways, but we must remain in him. Jesus says, remain in me and I will remain in you. So we have to remain in him. Otherwise we will be just like a wild vine bearing useless fruit. So that was very cool, and that's it.